Thank you. Now, Mary Fortune, woman of mystery in more ways than one. We don't actually have an image. We don't actually have an image of her. This is a commissioned artist's impression by the US activist and collagist Freddie Bear, and it is also on the cover of this biography. But there was another image which my co-writer and I, Megan, also wanted to use, and we did, and the publisher disagreed. But that's an image from J.W. Lint, and he's got a whole series of photographs, and they're damaged. And this seemed to be a very evocative image of a dark lady, and we have evidence that Mary Fortune had dark hair. And it seemed to very much express how she was very nearly erased from history. But no, we couldn't use that image. But it is, when I think of Mary Fortune, I think of that image. Although we do have a police description of her, and I'll read that out later on. Well, I'm partly here because she's a writer of the Central Goldfields, and she visited Ballarat and lived in Buninyong, where her second son George was born. And her memoir, which is collected in this book, The Fortunes of Mary Fortune, now long out of print, begins in 1855 when she gets off a ship in Port Phillip Bay with a small child and no visible husband. And she joins her father, who was a man called George Wilson, on the goldfields, and they travel around. He's working as a storekeeper. And they go to Castlemaine, Taradale, Buninyong, Maryborough, and then Kingower and other places. And she leaves a description of her Ballarat. I have never forgotten the strange appearance it presented. As we looked down on it, just ere dusk had been swallowed up in perfect darkness, save for the light of glimmering stars that shone coldly above it. It appeared to occupy a great saucer-shaped valley in which were thousands of canvas tents huddled together beneath our eyes, and crept in white shoals up every surrounding slope until miles were covered. Then one by one and hundreds by hundreds, and floods of light burst from the illuminated canvas dwellings until the whole space was clustered with ghostly lanterns, as from every hillside and lower level the pop, pop, crack, crack of thousands of firearms suggested a war. I would fancy the entire population were having a battle, I remarked to my father. Well, every man is simply letting all whom it may concern know that he is prepared to defend the gold he has won. It is a custom with diggers to fire and reload their guns every evening. Some things have changed and some things haven't. But when she's in Ballarat, she also buys herself an umbrella. It's brown, and this was the first clue that she wasn't. The most likely explanation why she would join her father in Ballarat from Canada, where she had been living, and cross a huge distance of sea, most dangerously, was that she'd been widowed. But when you look, the umbrella was brown, and these weren't mourning colours, which were black. And so I thought, maybe she's not a widow, and as it turned out, she'd run away from her husband, which is not so uncommon in those days. Divorce being difficult, and what was known as poor man's divorce was simply runaway, desertion, to be followed by bigamy. Daisy Bates did it several times. But Ballarat was significant to Mary even before she saw it, because about a month after she arrived in Castlemaine, she published in the Mount Alexander Mail, the Castlemaine paper, which is still in existence. And she sent in a revolutionary poem. Hooray for the free new land, and hooray for the diggers bold, and hooray for the strong unfettered right to search in the hills for gold. Turn up the sods, my strong free mates, and dig with a fearless hand, for there's not a castled lordling here in all this glorious land. Bit of a socialist she was. Now, that poem was actually quite widely reprinted in colonial newspapers. It was equivalent of a hit single. But she was informed by what conversation of diggers in Castlemaine, but she also knew a journalist who has significance to the Eureka story. And her friend George Semple, who was working for the Argus, he and Ebenezer Syme of the Age were brave enough to provide bail for Henry Seacamp, the editor of the Ballarat Star, who actually went to jail for sedition. And Semple actually described Seacamp as a brother of the quill, so journalists sticking together. Now, the memoir also includes a description of 4 days on the then Ballarat racecourse during a heatwave, how unlike today, when the bullocks pulling their dray took it in their wise heads to leave on a private pleasure expedition while we awaited their leisure in the delightful enjoyment of camping out on a shadowless plain in which the only shade available was underneath the dray without the bullocks. So she was a very expressive and effective writer. But she spent quite a bit of time in Buninyong, both the White Hills and the Green Hills rushes, and you go there now and there's not a trace left, just brambles. She also wrote for the Buninyong paper, of which not a trace survives despite the efforts of historians. But we know that she wrote a poem about a grave above the Yarrawee, and I'd love to know where that grave was. But she does have a really good description of the White Hills Rush, which by the time she arrived there in early 1856 was 12,000 people were camped there. It got its name from the miles of heaped up pipe clay. And you could see the hundreds of flags fluttering or drooping from their poles, the thousands of windlasses and moving diggers, the strange hum of a busy multitude, and the astonished and bewildered faces of newcomers like myself who'd never seen a great rush. And it was a pleasant experience to sit and stand at the open side of our temporary shelter and idly watch the scores of busy workers within view. One day, a party at a short distance away were busy getting up the wooden frame of a tent while a young woman was coolly washing a baby nearby on an American cooking stove, that's essentially a potbelly stove, that was set up on the unsheltered ground on which several pots were bubbling and steaming in the process of cooking. The noise was shocking and towards evening deafening. Hammering, chopping, bell ringing, band playing, shouting, laughing, fighting and singing were all represented horridly in the babel of a new rush, and one heard and saw as in a dream in which the dreamer's identity was lost. Now, subsequently, she mentions having an American cooking stove and remarks that it was put to illegal use. And what you could do with a potbelly stove was illegal. Well, one of the uses is distilling spirits, which was very much frowned upon by the police. But she seems to know an awful lot about the process of distilling, from personal experience. But at Buninyong is where her second son was born, and his father was unknown. She put his name on the birth certificate, but she left him behind in Canada. So a child conceived out of wedlock, which put his mother's reputation at risk as a fallen woman, inverted commas. And in the memoir, she actually never mentions the child, rather including anecdotes which are expressive of her frame of mind, including a cruel prank when an incompetent doctor who's given to drink there's a woman on the rush who's going into labour, and some pranksters actually get this man dead drunk, so he can't attend to her because it's their feeling that he'll kill her and the child because he's so incompetent. And that, you read that and you're actually quite shocked. But we do know a doctor did attend Mary Fortune. She later used his unusual name in a story, but her baby grew up under a bad star. Indeed, he became George. Now, while she's a chronicler of the gold rushes, she did write other things, also Gothic, an exquisitely excessive novel called Clizia, which might be the first Gothic novel published in Australia, being reprinted later this year. It concerns a woman who's conducting a vendetta against a titled family, and she has a magic snake necklace which on command comes alive and bites her victims. But she's also writes romances, tales of Irish life for the Catholic press, despite being a Protestant born in Belfast. And she also worked as a pioneering woman journalist, including for the Herald newspaper. And if I can be allowed to just read another short extract. Just what she's a very unconventional journalist for the time. And she writes about putting an advertisement in the paper to get a job as PQ. And a correspondent writing his QR sends her a questionnaire, and so she replies to it. What is the age of PQ? It is insolent in the extreme to ask any female her age. Who or what was her husband? What was her position in society? It is none of Mr. QR's business whether she had any husband at all, and she's very glad that her position didn't throw her into the society of QR during her early years at all events. Does she wear a crinoline? QR deserves to be garroted for the indelicacy of this question. Is music one of her accomplishments? Find out. Can she write well? Examine this and see. Is she quiet and domesticated? Ha ha. And it was this voice, this very engaging voice, that drew me to her, plus also the mystery that nobody seemed to know a thing about her, except that she was possibly a Mrs. Fortune, which sounded like a pseudonym. And at the start of research, all we had Mrs. and Fortune, and that she wrote crime. And just from that, it took us and my co-writer Megan, a very long time as records got digitised, but finally we had enough for a book. And the paradox of Mary Fortune is that she wrote crime and her son committed it. He was quite a significant criminal, if not a bushranger. She wrote as WW, a pseudonym which concealed her gender. She produced a crime serial, The Detectives album, and when I say album, that was photograph album, which was a new thing and was revolutionising crime and the police, because police for the first time could have a photographic record of criminals. And one of the things about George Fortune is that we have his mugshots. He's from Tasmania, when he'd got into trouble at the end of his life. And a collection of her stories was printed in 1871, and it's the first Australian crime collection of stories and the first by a woman worldwide. Now, the Detectives album, it's police procedurals at a time when women couldn't either be police nor lawyers. First person, police as hero, and viewpoint character convincingly. How did she know? Well, she'd married again bigamously to a Goldfields mounted constable called Percy Brett. By his second marriage, he became the great-grandfather of historian Judith Brett, who has been mildly embarrassed about this ever since. But then Mary was the bigamist, so he was free to... Her husband was still alive, so she was free to marry. He was free to marry again. And so she knows a lot about the police. She knows how to raid sly grog cellars, how you go about it. and also a lot about fizz gigs, which was the term for police informers. Now we've, name a cop show on the TV, there's lots, but you think about early crime fiction, Conan Doyle, Poe, Wilkie Collins, it's unusual to have a policeman as the viewpoint character. And for a woman to be writing it in the 1800s in Melbourne, well, that's more or less unique. Well, was she famous? Yes, she was in her time after a fashion. She had a huge audience, but they had no idea who she was. There was a quote in which she said, "Her very name is shrouded in mystery and no one knows who she is or where she lives." She was completely pseudonymous, never published under her real name. And it was not uncommon for women to use pseudonyms. Jane Austen was a lady, and the Brontes were famously Alice Acton and Cara Bell. She also had the pseudonym of Waif Wander, which was a self-description, and various other variants like Nemo, which means nameless. She's invisible, but she's very much heard because you can hear her voice, it's distinct. And her detective, Mark Sinclair, has a quite similar voice. And he's a persona through which she writes. And that means because she's writing as a man, she can deal with some very dark subjects, including rape and gang rape, which a respectable middle-class women were not supposed to know about if they wanted to be pure and angels in the house. Now, imagine trying to write under the burden of such social expectations. Imagine trying to live without divorce, she dealt with that by trying desertion and bigamy. The vote, she did live long enough to do that. Reliable contraception, no. Equitable pay, she wrote enormously, 500 short stories at least, for living just. And if you just happen to be slightly disreputable, excellent reasons for your publishers to conceal your identity. I did an interview with radio in Adelaide, and one of the questions I got was, was Mary a loose woman? And so I gauged the interviewer's age, and I said, well, she would have probably been just fine in the 60s. She could have been a hippie, free love. But at the time, she definitely had lovers. And she was described as a bohemian. She was described as the only truly bohemian writer of these parts in Melbourne and Victoria. Now, at the time, bohemian referred to Upper Bohemia, which is like slumming artists, Toulouse-Lautrec, unconventional arty times, but there was also Lower Bohemia, which was what her son inhabited as a career criminal. But they intersect, mother and son. She writes crime, he commits it, and she borrows from his life and deeds, and it turns up in her fiction. And one of the stories in this book is called Lost in Town, and only the fact that she was writing as a man permitted her to do it, because it deals with a voyage into the slums of Melbourne, and which involves muggings and the criminal class, and a corpse shoved into a cupboard. One of the things she's quite fond of doing, but it's quite noir, even before noir was defined as such. I'd love it to be filmed, I really would. But mainly she's informed by the major grief of her life from George, and his life was quite complicated. One of the things about the goldfields was that the social disruption was that there was a lot of homeless kids on the streets of Melbourne, and their families had broken up, the kids had run away from home, the father had deserted the mother, etc., etc. And so these kids were hanging around begging, earning a living on the streets by selling matches and stuff. And the colonial government decided to introduce a Neglected Children's Act, which would create industrial schools where these kids could be rounded up and committed. and sort of like a reform school teaching the girls home domestic skills and the boys trades. And so when George, at the age of 14, was picked up by the police for stealing a hat, which probably not the first time he did it, he's a very early example of what would be called larrikin, which starts roughly in Collingwood where he was living. And he's sent to the industrial school, which was in Sunbury, a very unpleasant and unhealthy place from which the kids were given to escaping at a great rate. And he escapes. And he goes home to Mum, who was living in Collingwood. And then he's picked up again, this time for stealing tobacco in company with a gang. And this time they say he's a repeat offender. And they say, OK, well, we'll send you to the hulks. They actually put kids in old prison hulks in Port Phillip Bay off Williamstown. They still kept on escaping. They'd steal the boat, or they'd swim to shore. They were a pretty lively lot. But he escapes, and he does it again. And this time he's sent to Pentridge, and eventually he's sent to the country as a sort of indentured servant on a farm, and he stays out of trouble for a while until he gets into temptation. And then this is a pattern throughout his life in which he's clean for a bit, and then he meets some old criminal friend and they lead him into doing something stupid. And this actually got his mother into trouble at one stage because she'd got a job with the Melbourne Herald. I will say that the appetite for, one of the things Mary Fortune, is that the appetite for true crime in colonial Australia was really huge. We think we're mad about crime, and this is from the Police News, which was published by an editor of Mary Fortune who encouraged her to write crime. And it was a mixture of radical politics and gory crime. And just a few things of Mary's colonial Melbourne, the police station and the town hall, and a very noir image of Prince's Bridge by artist Ludwig Becker, and Mary Fortune's journalism. Now, she was working for the Herald, and this is Megan and me in front of the window at the State Library, which Mary Fortune wrote, and we know that she did that because she wrote about it. And she was extremely reluctant to write fashion journalism. She wasn't interested. And this is her opinion of the current fashions. And there is a train from the century, from later in the century. And imagine dragging that through the dirt of the streets. Mary Fortune, was not interested in fashion, but there she was. She was working for the Herald as their women's editor. And one Boxing Day, she's short of material for her column. So she thinks, I'll go down to Pentridge, where George is locked up as a juvenile offender, and I'll go interview him. So she pulls her weight to get into the prison and interviews him, as not saying he's her son. And of course, the Herald found out, and she gets sacked. And this is not the first time he gets her into trouble. And this is probably the worst thing he ever did. This was Simpsons Road bank robbery, and Simpsons Road is now Victoria Street, and in what is now a coffee shop, there's a bank. How am I going for time? Okay, I can carry on. So basically, it was a branch of the major Richmond Bank, and one of the disreputable lurkers on the street noticed that the bank manager every morning turned up with a key because it was a sub-branch. And so he went off and talked to another career criminal who was a friend of George Fortune's, who he'd been previously arrested with and sent to Maryborough Jail, a man called Millage. And they put a team together of recently released Pentridge lags, and they resolved to rob the bank. Now, and this meant breaking into the bank and finding through a window upstairs, climbing up a ladder, and then listening while the char lady came and cleaned downstairs, and then waiting for the bank manager to turn up with his assistant, and then masked and with hats, they, armed with rifles and with jemmies, they assault the bank manager. It's just one of the curious things about this image is that apparently he really did look like Leon Trotsky. And they tied up the bank manager and they'd emptied the bank, and it was a very substantial haul. And then a horse and buggy drew up outside the bank, and they took their leave, leaving the bank manager and his sidekick bound and gagged. But these two men, despite being tied up, had the ingenuity to get their gags, get untied, go out the door and summon help. In the meantime, George Fortune, who was one of the robbers, and the rest of them are driving through the streets of Melbourne singing songs, and there they encounter one of the sergeants from Collingwood Police Station who recognises George and said, "Oh, got a gone to honest living at last." And said, "Yes, we've gone clean." And then they continue on to Studley Park, giggling all the way, no doubt, and there they bury the loot. And it actually takes quite a while for the police to find out who done it, and as was typical in those times, a fizgig was involved. One of the members of the gang treated a prize fighter who happened to be a fizgig to a drink and paid for it in a sovereign, and the fizgig thought, "Okay, that's a lot of money, I'll go and talk to my contact." And as a result, the entire gang were picked up and tried. And sent to Pentridge for 5 years under the circumstances, a very short sentence, but they were quite young. And in the course of the trial, Mary Fortune's identity got revealed, and that was another journalist said, it is a terrible thing that the young man Fortune, who has been sentenced to 5 years jail for bank robbery along with his villainous confreres, has a mother who has been engaged for some time in writing a crime serial, and surely this is a really bad influence upon her son. And this is about as close as her identity was revealed. The journalist just stopped short of naming the magazine in which she wrote, the Australian Journal, and because if he had revealed her as Waif Wanda and WW, she would have had no income. That was her career, although I suspect she would merely have come back under another name. But that was as close as she came to being revealed. And George, basically, the Simpsons Road bank robbery was one of the biggest cases in Melbourne, mainly because those involved kept on getting into trouble, including George. When he gets out of jail in 1890, he gathers the gang together and they immediately go bush and rob and go safe cracking in Albury. And this has its funny aspects again. I mean, George had a sense of humour, and this was that they needed something they couldn't open the safe, so they went and found a wheelbarrow, and they put the safe in the wheelbarrow and they wheeled it down the main street in the middle of the night till they get to the riverbank where they could break it open without anybody noticing, hearing the noise. And somebody looks out the window and thinks, "Oh, it's just some blokes wheeling their drunk friend home." And you imagine a safe in a wheelbarrow, but they just think it's a drunk. And at that time George got 10 years, and he didn't get out until 1900. But interesting, of his of the 5 men involved in the Simpsons gang robbery, one was hanged in New South Wales for assaulting a policeman. Another killed 2 police and shot himself before arrest. He was also a pedophile. And George would spend most of his life in prison, in fact dying in Hobart Jail. Curiously, 2 of the gang went clean. One came out to his wife and settled down and became a bootmaker in Brighton. Another one was referred to as Tiger, a half-caste because he was Afro-American. His father had been a former slave who went to the goldfields, as was not unusual. And Tiger, despite being targeted by the police and picked up again, was able to turn into a rather efficient bush lawyer and was able to cross-examine the Fizgig who turned him in again. And the Fizgig changed his evidence on the spot. And Tiger, who was a bit of a character, said to the judge, "Have you noticed that?" And was acquitted. And as far as I know, he didn't get into trouble again. But poor George, he comes out of... Mary clearly hopes he'd reform. But as was said to me in the course of researching this book, if you don't have mental problems before you go into prison, you do when you get out. And he would meet up with somebody and he'd get into trouble. And he decides when he gets out of prison after 10 years to try somewhere else where they don't know him, when he goes to Hobart, crossing back straight. But on the same ferry is another Pentridge leg. And what do they do? And of course, the Victorian police notify the Hobart police that some of their Pentridge escapees have taken the boat to Hobart. So the police are on the alert, and those 2 proceed to do a spot of burglary, and of course are picked up. And he gets repeat offences and eventually dies in jail from a kidney disease, but not before he's got into trouble for picking his jail lock. He was very good at picking locks, and for that they sent him into solitary. You could imagine a limestone prison in the depths of winter and bread and water. I'm surprised he didn't die on the spot. But yes, he was released because he was sent to Hobart Prison because he was dying of kidney disease, and he died. And he ended up in a pauper's grave in Hobart. And that's in memory all of those who interred in the pauper burial areas, and my co-writer Megan took that photo on a very wet day in Hobart. The other image is actually of Mary's grave. Now, she kept on writing about George and stories in which she borrowed the device about the wheelbarrow because that was too good not to use. But she kept on writing stories about reform and how can a criminal get out of prison and go straight when the police are looking for them, when the Fizgigs, and it was an open scandal that the informers would actually entrap newly released prisoners and lead them into committing crimes and then notify the police. This was very much an open scandal. And she keeps on writing stories in which he does reform and he has a good life outside jail, but unfortunately it never happened. She just kept on writing, and she had a hard life. She liked to tipple. One of the things that was known about her was that she was locked up several times for being drunk. It appears to be in the Melbourne jail, to judge from her very rude remarks about how unbecoming and how badly fashioned the women's jail clothes are. And was actually wanted at one stage as a hostile witness. And from this is the only description we have of her. This is from 1876. Information is required by the Russell Street Police respecting Mary Fortune, who is a reluctant witness, that is, hostile witness, in a case of rape. That is, she'd witnessed it, and lest she be called as a witness, she'd vanished, probably because she knew the offender, and the offender was a dangerous criminal. Description: 40 years of age, tall, pale complexion, thin build, wore dark jacket and skirt. How Melburnian. Black hat and old elastic-sided boots. Is much given to drink. Is a literary subscriber, that is, journalist, to several of the Melbourne newspapers. Stated she resided with a man named Rutherford in Easy Street, Collingwood. I've never been able to trace this man Rutherford. It probably wasn't his real name, but Easy Street was, of course, the site of Squizzy Taylor and also a very notorious murder, of which the alleged murder is being brought to trial very soon. And that is a very eerie coincidence, I find. So we don't have an image of hers yet, but I'm sort of in hope that somebody might go through a photo album and say, aha. But we have her writing to show just what sort of person she was, very lively, opinionated, unconventional, and it had an international reach. She was pirated in America. One of her stories was actually appeared in an American newspaper, attributed to a man, of course. Another one, interestingly, was picked up in the American equivalent of the Australian Woman's Weekly at that time, Godey's Ladies magazine, probably because she had a female detective in it. And that was highly unusual, but it shows she had an international reputation. Some of her writing for the Catholic press appeared in her homeland of Ireland, and I'm going to do a deep dive at some point just into the newspapers of England just to see how many of her stories might have turned up there. It's very easy to trace her piratings in America because there's a website called the Baker's, God, mine has gone a complete blank. Anyway, it's a website which is a listing of short detective stories published in America, and it's from that you can trace the name of a story and just see how far they went. So yes, she had an international reputation, only they didn't know who she was. But she was right until almost the last years of her life, when she was only really gave it up when she was blind. She'd gone blind. And enfeebled. However, there's evidence to show that she was eligible for the pension, but it was refused to her, probably because there were strict rules about you had to be sober for a period of time. Imagine trying to enforce that in Australia. And so the pension was refused, so she actually ended up in an aged care charity home in North Melbourne. But then the federal pensions were brought in, and in this case they weren't the strictest. There were no rules as regarding drunkenness being regarded as, well, what can you do? And so she did get a pension at the very end of her life, and she's buried in the family plot of the Masseners, who were the proprietors of the Australian Journal, who published her crime fiction. And she's there in Springvale, and that photograph is from the very rainy day in which I found her grave. And she'd written a poem about wattle, which was reprinted quite widely in Australia and even used in their Stedfords. And so I laid the wattle on her grave. And having done that, I then drove to Ballarat in really bad weather to a conference, the Australian Victorian Studies Conference, where I was happy to announce to the audience that I had found Mary Fortune's grave. And in the audience was a young woman, a young researcher who happened to work for AustLit, the bibliographical database. And when I said Mary Fortune had died in 1911, she immediately got out, in the question time, she got out her laptop, got into the database and updated the entry on Mary Fortune. So, the quickness of the digital thing. But we are planning to get a memorial up for her, which is only what she deserves. We don't know where George's exact location, but we do know exactly where she is. And it would be nice to have a memorial gravestone there, as has been done for various people in it, writers, famous people who died indigent and didn't have enough money for a grave. So, is that all right?
Yeah.
Yep. And that's about all I've really got to say. So, if anybody's got any questions.